morning. It is so wonderful to be with all of you today. I really love learning Torah with you, and particularly, it's such a bracha. It's really a blessing to start at the beginning again. Um, I think that there's this joke often made that we are part of the world's longest running book club that does the same thing year in and year out. And every year when we start the Torah over again, we're able to really plumb the depths of it for new insight. And something that I think is so really wonderful about our tradition is that every year we get to add commentary, and every year things jump out at us from the text. And I think that that's particularly important to say for Parashat Bereshit, because Parashat Bereshit, which I'll summarize as I always do, and then we're going to look at very specific sections of it, but Parashat Bereshit has many of the stories that a lot of us learned either through whatever kind of religious education we had, if any, whether it was through popular culture. People of all different backgrounds have some familiarity. We could have a discussion about whether or not that familiarity is accurate, but they have some degree of familiarity with a lot of the content in this week's Parsha, next week's Noach, but particularly this week's Parashat Bereshit. And so often when we come to these texts, we're carrying a lot of assumptions and a lot of ways of reading that were taught to us, or that were conveyed through translations we might have known in our childhoods, especially. And so, one of the things that I'm going to really invite us into today as we're learning together is to let that go and really kind of look at the text with a fresh perspective. So I want to start out by summarizing Bereshit as a parasha. Now, one should know that the rabbis, when they divided the Torah into the 54 parshiot that we have, they assigned a parasha a name based on what they thought of as the most significant word in the first verse of the parsha. So our parasha, Bereshit in the beginning is how it's often translated, but we could also translate it a little bit differently as when the world began, when creation began. Like there are lots of different ways to do that. We're not going to go into that specifically today, but I think it's important to just note that that's where the parasha gets its name, and that's also Bereshit is the name of the book of what we call in English Genesis. Bereshit, in the beginning, in the when creation began, at the beginning of time, whatever we want to translate that as, is the way that the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, understands this first book. So we open with two creation stories, which are quite diametrically different in lots of interesting ways, which many, many, many commentaries have gone over. So we're going to allow those commentaries to do that work for us, and we'll be looking at something a little different today. But I do want to say that something that really jumped out at me this year, which is not going to be the focus of our study, but something I really did want to take a moment to talk about. So we'll put the first chapter of Genesis on the screen if folks want to look at it. I'm not going to be reading it inside, but I'm going to be describing it, and then we're going to jump ahead to Genesis 4, which is that the first chapter. Awesome, thank you. The first chapter of Genesis is the first of the two creation stories. And in this particular creation story, we have the classic days on which different things are created. And as those things are created, Robert Alter points out in his commentary, which I definitely recommend, that there is a sense that God is a bit more distant in this creation story, and that divine speech is what is creating the things that are created as we go forward day by day by day. Something that I think is really cool to point out is that every time something is created and described over and over again, we are told that that particular thing was tov, that whatever the thing that was created was tov. This notion, I think, that the Torah, there's this idea, and we do see it a little bit in this first creation story, but I think there's a very inaccurate idea that the Torah positions the human being as the pinnacle, that everything really revolves around us and that we are going to basically be the ones who manipulate and control all of creation and that it's for our benefit. There's this idea that we are separate from the other living beings of the world and that we are the ones that will shape everything. We are the ones that are the creators and the actors. I don't actually think that that is what the Torah is arguing because the Torah keeps on saying in this particular chapter over and over and over again, it is good. It is good. It is good. All of the things that are created, um, especially on the third day, which happens to be today, it is good. It is good. These things are good. These things are told. This notion of things in the world that exist are good and that we are in relationship with those things that are good. So I think that that's something that's important for us to just note as we are anchoring in the Torah cycle again. The Torah begins not the story of the Jewish people. We don't get there for another couple of weeks. The Torah instead really begins with the creation and understanding of the world, the cosmos, the actual earth on which we live, and reminds us that this is good, which I think is a real clarion call to us to just as the earth is described as good, we too should have a relationship with the world that reminds ourselves of the goodness of it and that it's not actually for us to exploit, but it's actually for us to be in deep interdependent relationship with. I think that is a very key message of Torah that often gets lost, particularly in translation. So I'm just going to leave that there and really point out that the idea that things are good, I think, gives us a way of orienting to the world and orienting to all the creatures that we live with, human and non-human alike. And I think it's a really important way to start because we're going to look in just a minute at a very familiar and profoundly troubling text. But I want to kind of set that up. So we have this idyllic creation story in this first chapter of Genesis. We then move into the creation story that is more differentiated between Adam and Chava, between Adam and Eve. Um, and we have a different relationship with God in that text. Then we move from there into the very famous and often misunderstood story of the tree of life and knowledge of good and evil, and what role did Adam and Chava and the serpent play in that, and whose responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. How do the consequences get meted out? Okay, great. So we've gone there. And we're moving now to Genesis chapter 4. So we're going to start with verse 1. And I just want to invite, I will ask for a reader, but I'm going to do a little bit of summation of this first. If you do want to read, please be ready when you're called on to jump right in, and I will indicate where we're starting. Um, as we have moved to chapter 4 of Bereshit, Adam and Chava have just been left the Garden of Eden or expelled or whatever word you want to use. There are a lot of different ways to think about that. They are no longer in that idyllic place. They now understand the, law of cause and effect. They understand that there are like lots of consequences for choices made. Human beings have been the paradigm, of course, is we were in this place of great paradise and we are no longer there. Right. So now we have these, according to this text, right? We have this human couple who now have two children in quick succession. And this is a paradigmatic story of, I think there are a lot of things to take from this. One of them is human choice. So I want to actually invite, we're going to look at the first um, 9 or so verses from chapter 4, verse 1. Can I have a reader, please, in the English to read verses 1 to 9? And I will let you know that we may go 1 or 2 verses beyond that, but we're going to start with that.
Thank you. I see Ayala.
Okay. Now the human knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gained a person with the help of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. She then bore his brother Abel. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain became a tiller of the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh from the fruit of the soil, and Abel, for his part, brought the choicest of the firstlings of his flock. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh paid heed to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering God paid no heed. Cain was much distressed, and his face fell. And Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh said to Cain, "Why are you distressed? And why is your face fallen? Surely, if you do right, there is uplift. But if you do not do right, sin couches at the door. Its urge is toward you, yet you can be its master." Cain sowed to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain set upon his brother Abel and killed him. Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?"
Yeah, let's take one or two more verses. Thank you, Ayala, so much for your beautiful reading.
"What have you done? Hark, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Therefore you shall be more cursed than the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. If you till the soil, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. You shall become a ceaseless wanderer on the earth."
Okay, we'll pause there. We will pick back up in a little bit. Thank you for your absolutely gorgeous reading, Ayala. Thank you so much. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot here. And I want to just kind of point out a few things. And as things are coming to folks, as you have any insights arising, please do feel free to use the chat. And I will pause in a minute or two, and I'm going to turn it over to hear a little bit of those comments from the chat. But I do want to say that first we have this opening that Adam and Eve, Adam yada at Chava ishto, right? And many of us are very familiar with that biblical expression. And she conceives and she has Cain. And the interesting thing is in the Tomer, and she says, Haniti ish el Hashem, et Hashem, excuse me. I have created Haniti, the same kind of shorish when Hashem is referred to as Koneh Shemayim Va'aretz, creator of the heaven and the earth. There's this certain sense of Koneh, which means creation. It can also kind of connect to possession. But here, what I think is interesting is that Chava is saying, well, I'm actually like co-creating with God. I am in direct partnership. Here I am. I've actually birthed a third human being because this was according to this particular text, right? According to its worldview, this would have been the first live birth of a human being, right? Not in the way that we think about that. So that's something to just name. And then she very quickly has Havel. And what I think is really interesting is that we just read Kohelet. This jumped out at me immediately. We just read Kohelet on Shabbat Chochel Moed Sukkot, and Kohelet is the book of Ecclesiastes, and it's a 12-chapter book of lots of different maxims and they cover lots of different areas, and some of them feel really prescient and some of them feel really deeply complicated, but it's a wisdom book. It's part of what is known by scholars as the wisdom literature, and it is understood to be written by Shlomo HaMelech, although you wouldn't necessarily know that from the book because Kohelet refers to himself as Kohelet Melech Yerushalayim, Kohelet, king of Yerushalayim. But according to traditional understanding, it was written by Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, at the very end of his life. And in the very first chapter of Kohelet, we have the very well-known idea, Havel Havilim HaKol Havel. Everything is vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. Havel, though, actually in Hebrew, as Robert Alter does point out in his commentary, can actually mean breath or puff of air. I want to invite us to go into that as our way of understanding the word able, the word havel. Rather than understanding it here as vanity or vain, I want us to understand it as breath or puff of air. And I think it's important because it denotes a particular way in which his lifespan is going to be extremely short. And I think from a literary perspective, and here I am deeply indebted to Judy Klitzner of the Pardes Institute, who really explores this in the Pardes podcast this week, which I encourage folks to check out. Um, from a literary perspective, these things are not incidental. They are actually quite intentional. And I think it's also really interesting here that we're told immediately that Cain becomes a shepherd. And let's see, did I say that correctly? No, sorry. Havel becomes a shepherd, excuse me, and Cain becomes a farmer. I knew I flipped that. Um, and what's really interesting is, there's a whole conversation that Robert Alter points out. Does this tell us something about the anti-urban bias of the Torah? We're gonna table that, but I really encourage folks to look at the Robert Alter commentary. Um, there's this idea that we're told immediately about what the brothers do. One of them is a shepherd, one of them is a farmer. And it says in verse 3, Vayahi biketz yamim, v'yavo Cain mipri ha'adama mincha l'Hashem. That Cain brings an offering, and what's interesting is that mincha is actually a grain offering, right, from the produce that he has been tilling, right? And there's no sense, at least in my understanding, that this is ever something that's happened prior. We don't see this prior in the Torah. We don't know where Cain got this notion to bring some kind of offering to God. Here we are. And the Havel, hevi gamhu, mibekorot sono, in Havel, also, it's interesting here, also brings forward from the firstborn of his flock. And this is interesting. I don't think we got this here in the translation. U mechavel hen, and from the fat of it. So he is bringing a double offering. And what's interesting here is that, and then we have, and God heard, often it gets translated as regarded, but one way we can also understand this is heard. God favored it. God favored Havel's offering, and God did not favor Cain's. And Cain is extraordinarily upset. And of course, we have the dialogue with God and Cain, which I think is really interesting. Like Cain's face falls and he's dejected, and God says, "Why are you so dejected?" And Cain said, if you do right, there is uplift, right? Like if you behave properly, there will be positivity for you, right? And if you are not, then you're going to be very much tied to maybe we could say it, your most innate Yetzer, as we talk about, as the Musar tradition talks about this notion of the Yetzer, this notion of this desire to really follow after our basest, I don't love this expression, but like our most primordial or our first responses to things, right? So Cain's upset, to put this a lot more concretely, right? Like Cain's upset, right? Because God has not favored his offering. Now, of course, question automatically arises, which I think is a very fair question. What's God doing here? Right? I do not have an answer, but I think it's a very important question. And I think it's an important question that we need to actually grapple with. What is God doing? Why would God favor one offering over another? That's a really important question. And it's a real theme for the book of Genesis in a lot of very complicating ways. So we have Cain being upset because his offering has not been accepted. Then we have this dialogue with Cain and God. And then we have this, we know what happens here, but it's pretty mysterious in the text. They go out into the field, and there's a sense of Cain is going to say something, but Yomer Cain el Havel achiv, dot, 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 dot. So there's clearly something said here that we miss. And then, of course, the next thing we have here in the field, and Cain kills Havel. And then, of course, the classic, what have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground, and all of the ways in which there are consequences for that. But I think that it's very interesting to think about this particular dynamic and the ways in which the Torah, I think, from the outset, it's really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, the Jewish tradition is pretty clear that in lots of ways, human beings are incredibly capable of doing great things in this world, right? We do not have a tradition like other traditions do of this notion of original sin, or that we were born with this sense of original sin that we have to atone for. That's not a Jewish idea, right? Human beings have the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Ra, the good inclination, or the inclination to do evil. Again, really core imperfect translations. But ultimately, we have free will to make choices in our lives about the actions we are going to take. Those are not predetermined. We are not as far as I understand our tradition, we are not a tradition that believes in predestination of any kind of way. We really do believe that we are actors, we are choice agents, right? And that we get to make choices for the benefit or for the precise opposite of ourselves. And so there's a certain sense in here of, okay, we've just had an incident where one brother has this idea, bring an offering to God. And the other brother, seemingly the text is so spare, right? But one could imagine the other brother says, oh, I'm going to do twice. I'm going to do once more, once more. Any of you who have siblings, I had siblings, think about the ways in which sibling dynamics can work out this way, especially when you're children. But honestly, unfortunately, even when you're not children, the ways in which like sibling dynamics can work this way, there can be competition, there can be, one-upmanship. I mean, unfortunately, it's a thing that humans do, right? Both within family structures and then within larger societies, there's such a thing that humans tend to have of wanting to be on top in some way, right? Wanting to be better than. And so when when Cain is not accepted, now we don't know why, and I think it's a very fair question to ask, what on earth is God doing here? Why would the divine be making a choice between these two offerings, especially given the fact that we've never actually had an incident like this before in the Torah where offerings are brought? But be that as it may, and I think there are a lot of like literary answers to that. I don't have any good theological answers, but I think it's a very important question to ask. Um, when Cain is upset, then there is a certain way in which there's this conversation, and it's a very unsatisfactory one, although it does say, like, I think that there's what to take from this, which is, okay, you may not always get what you want, right? But you have a choice when things don't go the way that you want them to go, Cain. You could either actually deal with that and do some introspection, or you could assume that everything that happens is because of things that are external to you, right? It's somebody else's fault, right? It's somebody else's fault. And until that external reality is no longer present in my world, I am completely powerless to do anything on my own behalf. And unfortunately, Cain takes the latter road here. Rather than actually looking inward, and again, a lot of how I'm understanding this, I really am indebted to Judy Klitzner Pardes. Rather than taking in oh, well, what's happening here? Cain goes to the field and kills his brother, and then says, I'm not my brother's keeper. And it's this very deeply distressing story. And I think it's a way paradoxically and maybe even paradigmatically that we try to understand as cultures and societies how we act. And I think that the book of Genesis in particular, one of the things that I really appreciate about Torah is that time I'm reading the book of Genesis, I think to myself often, oh, these are the choices that I'm not going to make, right? Because we experience through the text what happens. Don't pretend, right? We don't pretend that this text doesn't exist here. We don't pretend that we're going to paper it over. No, this is a very tragic, very complicated text. And as we go forward in Bereshit, we have so many other examples of this, right? We have Abraham and Ishmael. We have Sarah and Hagar. We have Leah and Rachel. We have Yaakov and Esav. We have Yosef and his brothers, right? It's not until the very end of the Torah that Manasseh and Ephraim seem to have a totally non-confrontational sibling relationship. And I think that there's something really honest about that. We don't live in a perfect world where everyone, gets along, but we have choices. And what happens when we choose to assume that everything that happens in our lives, whether in this particular case, and I want to keep our learning to the text. So our example here of, okay, this offering wasn't accepted, and putting aside again the question that I've raised a couple of times already of like, why would God make that choice? That seems really problematic, right? But be that as it may, that's how the text is presenting itself. And I have no good answer other than to say I think that this is a foreshadowing of the ways in which this theme is going to repeat itself over and over and over again. But actually, I think there's something to be said about, like, so when the choice is made here that we don't care for, right? And this is a relatively small thing, which quickly escalates, right? We go from Cain has brought an offering that God doesn't like. Maybe it's quote unquote, or turns away from, or whatever the case may be. Abel's offering is from the animals, from the sheep, and from the fat, and Cain is from the fruit of the ground. Like, and for whatever reason, the choice is made, which offering is preferred. And we go from that to fratricide, which is a tremendous, tremendous tragedy and escalation of violence here. And we see in this text, this is not the way to be. This is absolutely not the way to be. But even still, even when Cain has his punishment meted out, Cain says, "Oh, it's too much," and so he gets a mark of protection. One thing I want to say very, very plainly, I have not done a ton of studying on the history of this, but the mark of Cain is a mark of protection in the Torah. It is not a curse. It has been mistranslated and misunderstood and misappropriated in ways that are tragic and have resulted in real harm to real people. And so when we are looking at these texts, I think it is extremely important to say that what is referred to as the mark of Cain is a protection, because Cain is going to be a wanderer on the earth, right, as part of the punishment. And so I want to just leave it there. I'm going to pause us, and I'm now going to open it up. I'd love to first hear from the chat, and then if there are any verbal questions, we can take those. But I first want to hear as many comments in the chat, and then we'll go from there.
I think if today gives any foreshadowing for the year, I think it is that people had questions, they put them in the chat, and you addressed a lot of them. So may all of our questions have clear answers, or at least the appearance of. And so some folks were asking why God would not accept specific offerings, and others sort of gave ideas as to why that may be. Maybe God could see that the offering wasn't from the heart. That was one idea. And I think there have been some more. And I think, as to what you were saying, just sibling rivalries, and maybe even like the idea that the firstborn would sometimes appear to have preference, but in fact there are all these examples of the second born being potentially having preference. So uh, not so many questions. So if folks want to either raise their hand or, oh, here we have a question from Laura who says, God didn't actually ask for the offerings, right?
Exactly, Laura. That's the mysterious thing here, right? Which I think ties into the reason that was given around maybe Cain's offer wasn't from the heart, right? God did not ask. That's a very good point. This just kind of happened, right? The text just says like time went by and Cain was like, I'm gonna bring this offering, right? So there are so many questions that I have around like, where did Cain get that idea from? Um, but yeah, God in this text, on the basic reading of it, as we've been doing this morning or today, wherever you are, um, did not actually ask for it, which is a really interesting other part of the dynamic. I have so many wonderings about, what was going through Cain's mind. Was he trying to make a point to his brother? I mean, as some folks have already said, right, we're going to see this over and over again, where the second born gets preference in some way or another. And so that's also happening in our text. But yes, it's absolutely the case that this was not brought for any external reason, which brings us into a spiritual question of when we are doing things, when we are bringing offerings, because if we think about offerings that are brought, those of you who have spent any time in synagogue this month, which depending on your practice, it could be hours and hours and hours of synagogue time or not. But if you are one of those who have spent a number of hours in synagogue, you might have seen that in the liturgy, there is a repetition of offerings that were brought for each of the chagim, each of the festivals, each of the holy days of Tishrei. And so that is, part of the will become the sacrificial offering system, which we'll really get into in Vayikra and Leviticus. So we've got a while before we get there. But in Genesis, we don't see that really except for here. And or we don't see that we don't see that before this. So it just happens, which is a really interesting thing. And so question is why? Why is it? One of the understandings of when sacrifices are brought later on in the Mishkan and then in the temple, right, is that is intended to be the best of what we have, right? That the notion of bringing forward the best of our flock, the best of our produce, we're giving over something that we value to that which is greater than we are, right? Our ancestors or the ancestors of the Jewish people, we were giving over something that is valuable and it connected us to the divine in some way, in a much more embodied, very direct way. And particularly for those of us who are not Orthodox Jews, many of us have been, kind of told and conditioned for, I think, really very understandable reasons to say, well, Avodat Lev, the service of the heart, has replaced the sacrifices, and thank God for that, because this is a much better way of worship, and we're not doing animal sacrifice anymore, and we're not bringing these offerings, and I, for one, am quite happy with the service of the lips and of the heart, and not the service of the goat and of the sheep. But I think it's very important to understand what function ritually it served. And so we can take that back to this text and we can say, oh, well, Cain had this idea to bring forward produce. So Cain does that. But then Havel brings not only the Bechor, the first of his flock, but also from the fat, really bringing the choicest pieces of what he has been able to bring forth from his shepherding. And so I think that there can be there an understanding of, what is happening around the sacrifice and is there a spiritual intention here? Or one could read this much more cynically and say, is this one brother trying to one up another?
Thank you. And before we call on Lisa, who has a hand up. I just want to share a few other questions that have come in through the chat. So I think for those of us who have at least some concept of what happens throughout the rest of the Torah, it is hard to go to the beginning and not reread what comes, look at things through the lens of what we know from later on. So just to clarify, both Cain and Abel are putting these offerings to God, and are they categorized in ways that happen later? Is this a peace offering, a sin offering, guilt, thanks, or do we not necessarily have those labels yet?
Yeah, I love that because, right, those of us who know how the Torah kind of proceeds from here do tend, I think, to think about the whole Torah as we're moving to the beginning, right? I know I do that as well. No, we don't have those categories yet.
Great, thank you. And just as always, I really appreciate um, the chat, and I suggest all those here to take a look and see how the folks on our call with us are approaching different questions. But I see that Laisa has a hand up, so I will ask you to unmute.
Hello. On with Cain's choice, I had a thought. Was it possible that Cain's choice to give was only for his own behalf, possibly something superficial, like to be a favorite, to give just to be, to get Hashem's favor, rather than giving to give, in thanks.
Oh, for sure. And I think that loops right back to exactly like there's no, I mean, I think we can't definitively, say what any particular motives were, but there could certainly be that reading of, yeah, Cain just did what Cain did for his own behalf. Exactly. Yes, for sure.
Let's see. Folks are bringing up more feelings of sibling rivalry, and just the idea of we should be sacrificing to the divine. Folks, I'm encouraging you to continue using the chat and maybe even raising your hand. And Rabbi, please feel free if this isn't the path you want to go down. But a question I have, you mentioned earlier in our talk today about the anti-urban bias of the Torah, and I'm curious if you can speak to that a little bit more.
Very intrigued by that. I found that in Robert Alter's commentary, and he was talking about Genesis chapter 20, which I did not get a chance to review in preparation for today, but I was really intrigued by this idea that there was this anti-urban bias, and that there was like a preference for rural, for which is interesting because it's interesting because both, if that's the case, right, and I don't have a lot to go on in that regard, but I'm thinking about Genesis, and a lot of what happens that's problematic happens in cities, right? Um, and not everything, because of course here we're dealing with the sadak, with the field, right? But it's such an interesting idea, and I don't really know what to make of it, but I'm really curious to study that more myself and figure out like what role does the kind of living environment that we actually live in play in how things unfold in the Torah, right? I'm thinking about, in Bereshit, we do get, I think it's one of Cain's descendants. It's later on in the fourth chapter. I do think it's one of Cain's descendants who builds a city, and then there's this really awful, awful conflict with Lemech. Lemech is just not a great guy. Not a great guy. He's later in the fourth chapter, and there's this way in which we get this kind of understanding or explanation of different people who started different aspects of human civilization, whether it's music, whether it's the cities, whether it's lots of different things. And it's a way of kind of, I understand it currently as it's a way of understanding kind of how the world works and why the world works out as it does. I'm particularly intrigued. This is just a fun fact as we are nearing the end of our shir, but I am particularly intrigued that one of the things that we're told is that we get those who created the musical instruments that people enjoyed. And I just love that we have a little mention of musicians. Here were those who built the cities. Here were those that made the weapons. Which were lovely musicians who did all these other like great things, you know? And it's just kind of lovely how things kind of get put in there in this like kind of offhanded way. Oh, it's this other thing that happened. So I often find that kind of reading the, you know, chronology and the descendants, it kind of you can kind of get a little like, oh, and what's happening here? What's happening here? It can kind of blend together. But then you have the moment of like, yeah, and then there's this thing that happens. So I always find that's really it kind of reminds me of like, oh, that's what this is doing here. It's serving this purpose of like helping us understand the world to the point of like, why on earth is there this anti-urban bias in Torah? I don't know, but I'm really intrigued. So I'm hoping as we move through Bereshit that that'll become clearer.
Thank you. That's super, super interesting. Um, we have just a minute left. I think we'll hear quickly from Stuart, and then Rabbi, we would love if you could sort of give us a bracha. Normally I say for Shabbat, but as we continue learning Bereshit, maybe you can give us a bracha for the week or even beyond. Okay, so we'll go to Stuart if you can ask a question quickly.
It says Chavel's offering. It says Vayisha Hashem et Chavel et Minchato. In what form did the Chavel know or didn't know that the offering was accepted or preferred? It seems that was it verbal, or how did they know that one was accepted and one was not?
Yeah, that's such a good question, Stuart. I feel like that's one of the many, many ambiguities of this text. It's actually not so clear. Like we don't know when it says in the psukim about which was preferred and which wasn't. I mean, you know, I guess from the simple reading of the text, there's some way in which the divine somehow communicated that, but it's really unclear as to how. So that's one of the many unanswered questions and one of the many ambiguities that makes this particular text, I think, so rich and complicated. So thank you for raising that. And then I'll close with a bracha for the remainder of the holiday season as we move into Bereshit and beyond. I really hope that this year, you know, for all of us, that we can find a lot of wisdom in Torah that will make us better people, whether that's wisdom in this parasha, kind of about what not to do, and we'll see that again and again in Genesis. We also Genesis about how to be a good human being in the world. May we really use the full complement of choices that we have available to us to really become the best human beings and the wisest people that we can, because our world is so desperately in need of that. And may Torah kind of anchor us in that. And as we are immersing ourselves in this thousands of years of tradition, may that actually translate into how we are living our lives in this world.
I mean, thank you so much, Rabbi. And as always, we will send the recording and the source sheets. And I also quickly am going to add an opportunity into the chat. We are running a Shmini Atzeret Yizkor service on Thursday at noon Eastern time. If you are interested in saying Yizkor and Kaddish, you are welcome to join us for that, and we'll include that in the follow-up as well. And again, it's odd to not say Shabbat Shalom, but wishing you well in the rest of your week. Bye-bye.